The bank called me in the middle of my own sister's wedding reception, a wedding I was never invited to, and asked if I had just spent $20,000 in one night. I hadn't spent a cent. I was at my desk, 2 miles away, with my wallet sitting right beside my keyboard. But somewhere across town, my name, my card, and my money were paying for a party I didn't even know was happening. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly who did it, why my own parents thought they'd get away with it, and the one sentence my mother said to my face months later that proves she never once thought she'd done anything wrong. Stay to the end, because the final thing that happened at my front door is the same excuse thousands of families are using on their most reliable child right now, and if you've ever been the responsible one, you need to hear how this ends. My name is Harper Reyes, and this is how my own family tried to steal my life out from under me and ended up losing theirs instead. I lived in Austin, Texas, and worked as a financial analyst for a mid-sized investment firm downtown. Nothing about my life had been handed to me. I studied for years, worked overtime through my 20s, and lived below my means while friends my age were taking vacations and buying new cars. I wasn't chasing luxury. I was building something stable, something that couldn't be pulled out from under me. I earned a good salary, and I was proud of it because every dollar of it came from actual work. Whenever anyone in my family needed help, I was the first call they made. A late utility bill, a car repair, a small loan that somehow never got paid back but never turned into an actual argument either because I never asked for it too. I told myself that's what family does for each other. I never kept a tally. I never once thought I was being used. That's the version of me you need to remember because she's about to learn a very hard lesson. My younger sister, Brielle, lived a completely different life. Things simply worked out for her. Not because she tried harder, but because our parents, Walter and Diane Reyes, made sure they did. Every mistake she made got quietly smoothed over. Every slightly imperfect choice she made got reframed as bad luck. Meanwhile, my accomplishments barely got a mention at the dinner table. I remember the night I found out I'd passed my licensing exam on the first try, something most people in my field take 2 or 3 attempts to do. I called my parents to share the news. My mother congratulated me for exactly 11 seconds before pivoting to a story about how Brielle had just gotten a compliment from her manager at the boutique, where she worked part-time. I laughed it off in the moment. I told myself I was being sensitive. I told myself every family has an imbalance like that. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself that for years, because it was easier than admitting the truth. Looking back now, there were dozens of smaller moments like that one. Birthdays where my gift got opened last. Holidays where I was handed a list of tasks the second I walked through the door while Brielle was told to just relax and enjoy the day. At the time, none of them felt significant enough to bring up. Together, they told a story I refused to read. Then, about 6 weeks before everything blew up, something in my family shifted. Calls that used to come weekly slowed to almost nothing. When I called my parents, they were suddenly always busy, always promising to call back later. Later never came. Brielle stopped answering my texts completely. We'd had a standing monthly dinner for years. Suddenly, every single one got canceled at the last minute. My mother wasn't feeling well. My father had extra work. Brielle was dealing with something personal and would explain later. I believed every single excuse because I had no reason not to. Life gets busy. People get distracted. That's what I told myself while the people I trusted most were quietly building a secret that would blow my entire world apart. Here's where it starts moving fast, because it moved fast for me too. A package that had been mistakenly sent to my old address ended up at my parents' house. I drove over to grab it on a Tuesday afternoon. Nobody was home. I still had the spare key they'd given me years earlier, so I let myself in like I'd done 100 times before. The mail was stacked on the kitchen counter, and as I sorted through it looking for my package, one envelope stopped me cold. It was already open. A printed invoice had slipped halfway out of it, and right at the top of the page, in bold letters, was my sister's full name. The invoice was from a luxury wedding venue. The total made my stomach drop, and then I saw the date. For days away. I stood there in my parents' kitchen, completely frozen, trying to convince myself there had to be some explanation. Maybe it was for a friend's wedding she was helping plan. Maybe I was misreading it. But everything on that page said the same thing, over and over. This was Brielle's wedding, happening in 4 days, and nobody in my family had said a single word to me about it. I called my mother from the driveway before I even started my car. She answered on the fourth ring, sounding surprised to hear from me, like she hadn't expected this call to ever come. I asked her calmly, evenly, if Brielle was getting married that weekend. There was a long pause, long enough that I already knew the answer before she gave it. Yes, she finally said. Not, we're sorry we didn't tell you. Not even, we meant to call you. Just yes, delivered flat, like she was confirming the weather. I asked her why nobody had told me. Her answer is the one I still hear in my head. She said they wanted a smaller, more peaceful ceremony with only the people who wouldn't make the day uncomfortable. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, that my presence might have made things uncomfortable. I asked what that meant. I had never once caused a scene at a family event. I had never argued with Brielle about her relationship. I had never done anything except show up and help every single time. My mother wouldn't answer the question. She just repeated that this was the decision they'd made, told me not to take it personally, and hung up, hoping I would understand. I sat in that driveway for a long time after the call ended. The pain wasn't really about missing a wedding. It was the realization that my own family had planned one of the biggest days of Brielle's life and decided, deliberately, that I didn't belong in the room. I thought about calling Brielle directly and demanding an explanation. Then I stopped myself. If she wanted me there, she would have asked me herself. I wasn't going to beg for a seat at a table where I'd already been erased. So I wiped my face, drove home, and told myself that sometimes silence says more than any answer ever could. The day of the wedding, I treated it like any other Tuesday. I went to work. I stayed late finishing a financial report, mostly because staying busy was easier than sitting at home thinking about the party happening without me. Most of my coworkers had already left. The office was quiet except for the hum of the air conditioning and my own keyboard. Around 8 in the evening, my phone rang. The screen said it was my bank. At first I assumed it was routine, a reminder about a payment, maybe a promotional call. Something told me to answer anyway. A woman introduced herself from the fraud department and asked if I was currently authorizing several large purchases on my credit card. I told her no, immediately, because my card was sitting right there on the desk next to my laptop. She asked me to stay on the line while she read through the transactions one at a time. The first charge was for a luxury hotel ballroom. The second was for an upscale florist, then a catering company, then a jewelry boutique, then a second charge tied to an event venue. Each one was thousands of dollars. By the time she finished reading the full list, the total sat just under $20,000, all within the last hour. I told her, completely stunned, that I hadn't approved a single one of those charges. She asked me to confirm my card was still in my possession. I picked it up off the desk and read her the last 4 digits. It matched exactly. She froze the account immediately and blocked any further transactions, explaining that the rapid sequence of large purchases had already triggered the bank's fraud detection system before I even called. As she kept talking, something clicked into place in my mind, so hard it almost knocked the wind out of me. Those businesses weren't random. A ballroom, a florist, a caterer, a jewelry store, an event venue. Those were wedding expenses, the exact kind of purchases someone makes on the actual day of a wedding. And my sister's wedding was happening that very night. I asked the representative, my voice shaking, if all the charges had occurred within the last hour. She confirmed it. I thanked her, hung up, and sat there staring at my phone, completely unable to move. It all clicked at once. Someone had been using my personal credit card to pay for my sister's wedding, a wedding I wasn't even invited to attend. And because several of the later charges had been declined after the freeze, I knew there had to be chaos happening at that reception right now. Vendors demanding payment, bills suddenly bouncing, a room full of confused guests wondering why the night was falling apart. I hadn't done anything wrong. Whoever had done this had created the disaster themselves. But I already understood that the secret my family had been hiding wasn't just that I'd been left off a guest list. It was something far worse. About 20 minutes later, my phone rang again, a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. I answered instead. The man on the line introduced himself as the manager of the wedding venue, and he sounded genuinely stressed. He asked if he was speaking with Harper Reyes. When I confirmed, He explained that my phone number was listed as the contact for one of the payment authorizations, and he wanted to know if I was coming to settle the remaining balance because several transactions had just failed without warning. I told him, as calmly as I could manage, that I had never agreed to pay for any wedding and that my bank had already opened a fraud investigation. There was a long, uncomfortable silence. Then he quietly apologized, clearly caught off guard, and told me he'd had no idea the payments might have been unauthorized. He explained that deposits had actually been coming in on my card for weeks, not just tonight. My stomach dropped through the floor. This wasn't a single reckless night. Somebody had been using my financial information for a long time, without me ever noticing. The second I hung up, I started running through every possible way someone could have gotten my card details. And then one memory came rushing back, clear as day. Months earlier, I'd gone to my parents' house for dinner. When I got home that night, I realized my wallet wasn't with me. I called my mother, panicking, and she told me it was sitting right there on the kitchen counter, exactly where I'd left it. I picked it up the next afternoon. Everything inside looked untouched. At the time, I didn't think twice about it. Now, that memory felt completely different. My wallet had sat, unattended, in my parents' house overnight. That's the detail I want you to hold on to, because it's about to matter a lot more than you think. The next morning, I sat down with the bank's fraud investigator and answered every single question honestly. I handed over statements, explained my whereabouts for every transaction, and gave them permission to pull my work records and office security logs to confirm exactly where I was when each payment went through. Every piece of it matched my story perfectly, because every piece of it was true. While the investigation moved forward, things at the wedding kept getting worse. Vendors who hadn't been paid started refusing to keep working. The caterer demanded payment before serving another plate of food. The florist wanted the final balance immediately. The DJ, according to a cousin who was there, actually stopped the music mid-song when someone from the venue pulled him aside to explain the accounts had been frozen. Guests noticed family members arguing in the corners of the room instead of dancing. Brielle was crying, her makeup streaked, standing near the gift table while relatives whispered around her. My parents were rushing between vendors, trying to talk their way out of a situation they had created themselves, my father pulling out his own personal card and getting declined twice in front of the catering staff. The groom's family stood off to the side, visibly confused and embarrassed, with no idea why payments were suddenly bouncing in the middle of the reception, quietly asking each other if this was normal for her side of the family. What was supposed to be one of the best nights of my sister's life slowly turned into a public spectacle, whispered about table by table, phones quietly filming corners of the room that were never meant to be remembered. And I sat alone in my apartment, feeling nothing close to satisfaction, just betrayal, and the growing certainty that the story was only getting started. The morning after the wedding, I expected a phone call with some kind of apology or explanation. Instead, my father's name lit up my screen, and the second I answered, he was already yelling. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't ask what had happened on my end. He blamed me, directly, immediately, for destroying Brielle's wedding and humiliating the entire family in front of the groom's relatives. I tried to explain that I had simply reported fraud the moment the bank called me. He wouldn't hear it. He told me that if I actually cared about this family, I would have kept quiet and fixed it later, whatever that was supposed to mean. Before I could respond, my mother took the phone. Her voice was cold, controlled, almost businesslike. She told me I earned more money than anyone else in the family, and paying for the wedding wouldn't have hurt me. I sat there in stunned silence, because she wasn't denying that my card had been used. She wasn't pretending it was some kind of accident. She was justifying it, as if my money existed to be spent by whoever in the family needed it most. I asked her one direct question. Were you ever planning to tell me? She went quiet for a few seconds, and then said they didn't think it was necessary, since you always helped the family anyway. That single sentence hurt worse than every lie that came before it. A few minutes after that call ended, Brielle called me herself, crying so hard I could barely understand her. Between sobs, she accused me of ruining the happiest day of her life. She said I'd always been jealous of her, that things always came easier for her and I couldn't stand it. I sat there listening, honestly stunned, because I had spent years supporting her, celebrating her, never once trying to compete with her. She never asked me how my credit card had ended up funding her wedding without my permission. She only cared that the money had stopped flowing. After all 3 calls ended, I sat alone in complete silence and replayed every excuse I'd ever made for my family. For years, I told myself the favoritism wasn't real, that I was imagining it, that Brielle just needed more support because she was younger. But there was nothing left to explain away anymore. The truth was sitting right in front of me, undeniable. They had planned an expensive wedding, funded it secretly with my stolen credit card, cut me from the guest list entirely, and expected me to simply absorb the consequences without ever finding out. They never planned on paying me back. They believed I would just keep working, keep earning, and keep quietly cleaning up their messes, the way I always had. Something shifted in me at that exact moment. I stopped feeling guilty for protecting myself. I finally understood that the real betrayal wasn't the stolen money. It was realizing the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally had stopped seeing me as a daughter and started seeing me as a walking bank account they believed belonged to them. And here's the attention anchor I promised you at the start. Everything you're about to see, the security footage that changes the entire case, the groom's confrontation with my family, and the moment my parents showed up crying on my front porch months later, all of it comes back to one small detail I mentioned earlier in the story. My missing wallet, sitting alone on my parents' kitchen counter overnight. Keep that in the back of your mind, because it's the thread that unravels everything. After those 3 calls, I made a decision that wasn't easy, but was absolutely necessary. I stopped arguing with my family completely. I stopped responding to guilt trips, angry texts from relatives who only had half the story, and vague voicemails asking me to just talk it out. From that point forward, I only spoke to the people handling the fraud case. I answered every question they asked, handed over every document they requested, printed out my full bank statements, and laid out a clear timeline showing exactly where I was during every single unauthorized transaction. My office security logs backed up every claim I made. There wasn't a single gap in my story because I had nothing to hide. A few days later, one of the investigators called with an update that hit me harder than I expected. Several of the businesses involved had working security cameras, and they'd agreed to hand over the footage. In one recording, my father, Walter, was clearly seen speaking directly with employees while arranging payments. In another, my mother, Diane, was sitting at a desk, calmly signing paperwork connected to the wedding contracts. Neither of them made any effort to hide their faces or their identities because they never imagined anyone would question it. They believed this would all just quietly go through, the way everything else in their lives always seemed to. Hearing that confirmed on camera nearly broke something in me all over again. Some small part of me had still been holding on to the idea that maybe there was a misunderstanding somewhere in all of this. That hope died the second the investigator described that footage. My parents had knowingly, deliberately used my financial information without ever asking me. Around the same time, the truth started reaching someone else, my sister's brand new husband, a man named Tanner Voss. Up until then, Tanner genuinely believed Brielle's family had paid for the entire wedding themselves. When vendors began explaining exactly why their payments had suddenly failed, he learned the truth. The money had come from my personal credit card without my knowledge or consent. He confronted Brielle directly and asked her point-blank if she knew where the money had actually come from. She dodged the question completely, so he went to my parents, hoping for a straight answer. Instead, they gave him 3 different versions of events and tried blaming the bank, the vendors, and eventually even me. The more questions Tanner asked, the more the story fell apart in front of him. He'd walked into this marriage believing everything had been handled honestly, and now he understood the entire wedding had been quietly built on a lie. Not long after, I heard through the investigators that Tanner had started cooperating with them directly. He didn't want his name anywhere near a fraud case. For the first time since this whole thing started, someone completely outside my side of the story was asking the exact same questions I'd been asking from the very beginning. I felt no satisfaction watching him realize the truth. He'd been misled too. He was just one more person my family had used and lied to. As the weeks went on, the case grew far beyond anyone in my family expected. What started as a handful of suspicious charges on one credit card turned into an investigation involving multiple businesses, each with their own contracts, their own employees, and their own paper trail. Vendors who'd never been fully paid started filing formal complaints of their own. The florist provided text messages between her staff, and my mother confirming payment arrangements made weeks before the wedding. The venue produced a signed contract with my mother's signature on the final page, dated over a month before I ever found that invoice on the kitchen counter. The jewelry boutique had a receipt with my father's driver's license number written down as identification for a large purchase he claimed, on record, was a gift for his daughter. Every new statement added another piece to the exact same story, and it became harder and harder for anyone involved to keep denying it. I stayed completely out of it publicly. I went to work every day like normal. I didn't contact my family, and I didn't respond to relatives who only knew fragments of what had actually happened. I trusted the evidence to eventually speak louder than any of their excuses ever could. Meanwhile, life inside my parents' house grew more strained by the day. Brielle and Tanner, barely a few weeks into their marriage, were arguing constantly over the fallout. Tanner had lost real trust in the family that had promised to welcome him. His own parents, humiliated in front of relatives who'd witnessed the scene at the reception, urged him to keep his finances completely separate from Brielle's until everything was fully resolved, determined to make sure nothing like this could ever touch them again. My father, meanwhile, was facing serious legal consequences of his own. Investigators continued combing through documents and footage, and he was formally informed that criminal charges were a real possibility because of the unauthorized use of my financial information. My mother reacted in a completely different way. Instead of accepting any responsibility, she started calling relatives one by one, telling them I had fabricated the entire situation because I was bitter about missing the wedding. She insisted I was trying to destroy the family out of pure jealousy. At first, a handful of relatives believed her because they'd only ever heard her version of events. But that changed fast as more documentation came out. Bank records, signed contracts, witness statements, security footage. The truth became impossible to keep denying, and slowly, one by one, relatives who had stayed silent for years started reaching out to me directly. Some apologized outright for believing the rumors so quickly. Others admitted something even harder to hear, that they'd noticed the imbalance in how my parents treated us for years, but never said anything because they didn't want to start family drama. Hearing that stung in a way I hadn't expected. It meant people had watched this happen for years and stayed quiet. They remembered birthdays where my achievements got glossed over while Brielle was praised for far smaller things. They remembered holidays when I arrived early to help set the table and left late after doing every dish, while Brielle came an hour after everyone else and left before dessert was even served. One aunt told me she remembered a Thanksgiving years earlier when I'd driven 4 hours in a snowstorm to help host, and my mother had introduced me to a neighbor as the one who's always around to help out, instead of simply saying my daughter. She said she'd thought about that sentence for years and never said anything. Another cousin admitted he'd noticed how every family photo somehow ended up with Brielle in the center and me at the edge of the frame, and had chalked it up to coincidence until now. They remembered being the one everyone called when there was a problem to solve, and never once being thanked for it. For the first time in my life, I felt genuinely seen, not because anyone suddenly felt sorry for me, but because they finally said out loud what I had spent years convincing myself wasn't real. The lies my parents had built their entire family dynamic on were finally collapsing, and there was no one left for them to blame but themselves. After everything that had happened, I realized I had exactly 2 choices. I could spend every remaining day replaying what my family had done to me, or I could take everything I'd learned and build something better with it. I chose the second option, and I never looked back. The pain didn't disappear overnight, but I refused to let it run the rest of my life. I threw myself into my work, started taking better care of myself, and finally made room for plans I'd been putting off for years, always because I was too busy helping someone else. Owning a home had been a dream of mine for a long time. I'd saved for it steadily, but I kept delaying it, always redirecting that money towards some family emergency instead. This time, I did something for myself. After weeks of searching, I found a small house that felt warm and quiet the second I walked in. The day I got the keys, I stood alone in the empty living room and just smiled. It wasn't the biggest house on the block, but it was entirely mine, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was actually starting a new chapter instead of just surviving the current one. A few months later, My manager called me into his office. He thanked me for my work ethic and told me I was being promoted into a senior position. He said I'd always been reliable, honest, and calm under pressure, exactly the qualities my own family had spent years quietly exploiting. Hearing that from someone who actually valued me for the right reasons meant more than he probably realized. My worth was never supposed to be decided by how my family treated me. I had built my career and my success entirely on my own effort. Outside of work, I wanted to turn this experience into something meaningful. I started volunteering with a local financial literacy organization, teaching people practical ways to protect themselves from scams, identity theft, and fraud, the exact nightmare I just lived through. I taught people to check their bank statements regularly, protect their personal information, and report anything suspicious immediately. Every time someone thanked me for helping them avoid a mistake before it happened, I felt like something genuinely good was finally growing out of one of the worst experiences of my life. At one of the organization's community events, I met a man named Mason Cole, an architect who'd volunteered to help redesign the group's office space. We started talking during a lunch break, and the conversation felt easy in a way I wasn't used to. He asked about my interests, my career, my volunteer work, but he never once asked how much money I made or what I could offer him. He listened when I talked. He respected my opinions without needing to challenge every one of them. Over the following weeks, we spent more and more time together. Long walks along the lake near my new neighborhood, quiet dinners where the conversation never once ran dry. A rainy Saturday spent assembling furniture in my new house while he told me stories about buildings he designed, and I told him, for the first time out loud to anyone, the entire story of the wedding, the invoice, and the phone call from the bank. He didn't flinch. He didn't ask why I hadn't just paid it and kept the peace. He simply said, "You did the right thing," and meant it. He made me laugh without trying too hard, and he never once judged me for the mess with my family. If anything, he admired that I'd stayed honest through all of it, even when lying or staying quiet would have been so much easier. Being around Mason felt completely different from anything I'd known before. I didn't feel responsible for solving his problems. I didn't feel like I had to earn basic kindness by sacrificing pieces of myself. For the first time in years, I understood what real, mutual respect actually looked like. Healthy relationships, I finally realized, are built on trust and equal care, not guilt and not obligation. Several months passed without a single word from my parents or Brielle. That silence gave me exactly the space I needed to heal, and slowly I settled into the peaceful life I'd built for myself. Then, one quiet Saturday afternoon, my doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened the door, I froze completely. Standing on my porch were my father, my mother, and Brielle, all three of them looking exhausted, looking nothing like the people who had screamed at me over the phone months earlier. Nobody smiled. Nobody spoke at first. Finally, my father quietly asked if they could come inside. I didn't want a scene playing out in front of my neighbors, so I stepped aside and let them in. They looked around my living room before sitting down, and I noticed something immediately. All the confidence they'd carried months earlier was completely gone. My mother spoke first. She said things had become extremely difficult. Legal bills kept piling up, and the financial pressure was worse than they'd expected. She admitted, for the first time, that they needed help. My father cleared his throat and asked if I would forgive them. Then he asked the real reason they'd come. Would I withdraw my statements and tell investigators the whole thing had just been a misunderstanding? I looked at him without saying a single word. Before I could even respond, Brielle broke down crying, saying her marriage had become filled with tension because of everything that happened, begging me to help them move past it, reminding me over and over that we're still family. I listened to all of it, and I noticed something important the entire time. Not one of them apologized for actually stealing from me. Not one of them admitted what they'd done was wrong. They only talked about how difficult their own lives had become because of it. My mother mentioned, almost in passing, that reporters from a local news blog covering the fraud case had started calling the house, and that neighbors had started asking questions. Even then, in the middle of everything, her concern was the embarrassment, not the theft itself. So I took a breath, and I asked them one simple question. When you were planning that wedding, did any of you think, even once, about inviting me? Silence. Complete silence. My father looked at the floor. My mother looked at her hands. Brielle looked at me like she was hoping I'd fill the silence for her, the way I always had. I reminded them that they had deliberately left me off the guest list for one of the biggest days of Brielle's life, while secretly planning to fund the entire thing using my stolen credit card. They wanted my money. They never wanted my presence. They had treated me, for years, like someone who only existed when they needed financial help. My mother tried to interrupt, insisting we made mistakes, but I gently stopped her right there. I told them forgiveness and accountability are not the same thing, and they never will be. Maybe someday I'd forgive them, purely for my own peace of mind, but that would never erase the choices they made or the consequences that follow those choices. I would not lie to investigators for them. I would not become the one responsible for cleaning up yet another mess they had created entirely on their own. The room went quiet again. My father slowly stood up, finally understanding there was nothing left to argue. They walked to the front door without another word. Before they left, I told them I genuinely wished them well, because I meant it. I didn't hate them anymore. I simply understood, finally, that loving someone does not mean allowing them to keep hurting you over and over. I closed the door behind them, locked it, and walked back into my own home feeling lighter than I had in months. The months that followed brought a kind of closure I honestly never expected to feel. The legal process was long and slow, but I stayed patient and let the evidence do exactly what it was always going to do. When the investigation finally wrapped up, the outcome was clear and unambiguous. The people responsible for the unauthorized charges were held accountable, and a court ordered financial restitution to cover every dollar that had been taken from me. My credit history was fully repaired. My name was completely cleared. The thing my family had tried to twist into my mistake was finally recognized, officially, for exactly what it always was, a crime committed against me, not by me. Around that same time, I learned more about what had really happened inside Brielle's marriage. The trust between her and Tanner had been damaged in a way that was almost impossible to repair. A marriage built on secrets from day one doesn't just heal because both people want it to. They tried to work through it, but the foundation was cracked before they ever said their vows. I didn't take any pleasure in watching them struggle. I knew exactly what it felt like to be hurt by people you trusted completely. I simply accepted, finally, that every choice carries its own consequences. My parents had to face the results of their choices too. 4 years, they had protected Brielle from every mistake and quietly expected me to absorb every responsibility without complaint. They believed my patience would forgive absolutely anything forever. What they finally learned, the hard way, is that even the most patient, understanding person eventually reaches a limit. Around the same time, my own life kept getting steadily better. I spent an evening at a small restaurant with Mason, talking quietly about our plans for the future and looking around at how peaceful my life had genuinely become. Sitting there, I thought back over everything that had happened, start to finish. There was a time when I believed revenge meant making people suffer exactly the way they'd made me suffer. But I understand something now that I didn't understand then. The greatest revenge was never about destroying someone else's life. It was refusing to let their actions destroy mine. I rebuilt my confidence. I created a safe, quiet home that belonged entirely to me. I grew in my career on my own merit, and I surrounded myself, finally, with people who valued me for exactly who I was, not for what I could provide. I no longer need approval from people who spent years failing to appreciate me in the first place. Looking back on all of it, I still wish, in some quiet way, that my family had simply chosen honesty over taking advantage of my kindness. But I also know now that walking away from unhealthy relationships can be the strongest decision a person will ever make in their entire life. Real family was never about sharing a last name. It's about trust. It's about respect. It's about genuine care that doesn't come with a hidden price tag attached to it. Love should never come with conditions, and support should never be something people demand while giving absolutely nothing back in return. I think about that night at my desk often, the phone ringing, the list of charges, the exact moment the pieces clicked together. At the time it felt like the worst night of my life. Looking back now, it was the night everything finally became clear. It was the night I stopped explaining away what I already knew and started building a life where nobody gets to spend me down to nothing and call it love. I lost the family I thought I had, but somewhere in the middle of losing them, I found something far more valuable. I found myself, and I found people who actually deserve to be called family. If this story hit close to home for you, if you've ever been the reliable one, the responsible one, the person everyone calls when something goes wrong but nobody thinks to invite when something goes right, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, because I guarantee you're not the only one. Hit that subscribe button, drop a like on this video, and share it with someone who needs to hear today that protecting yourself isn't betrayal. It's survival. I'll see you in the next one.